Okay, so here we have a bit of a mini lesson. You'll notice in your textbook there's some examples that show this, but there's not quite a section in your textbook dedicated to this. So we have to kind of quick learn how to apply the distributive property in algebraic expressions. Again, please take notes on every slide if you haven't already in class. Okay, here is just a reminder and something that'll help us think about the distributive property. We're not using the x anymore to mean multiplication because sometimes it'll be a variable. Like in the bottom right hand corner in the blue writing, you see 6x is going to mean 6 times x. Okay, another thing that's very important is up top left here when you see a 6 and then the 4 in parentheses. It doesn't really matter the numbers, I just picked random numbers, but the parentheses are going to signify multiplication every time. So the 6 outside of the parentheses means 6 times the 4 that's inside the parentheses, okay? Now, we use that same principle here. If you look at this first example under distributive property, that 4 is multiplying the terms that are inside the parentheses. The only difference now between the previous example is that now we have 2 terms or 2 numbers inside the parentheses with the plus sign between them. Now, this gets a little tricky. You might have seen distributive property in 5th grade, so some of this might be a reminder. But if you look at the bottom example that we'll get to in a minute, 4 times x plus 2, we're now applying the distributive property in algebra. But let's look at the top example first. Now, if you remember order of operations, you would make sure you do the parentheses first, or what's inside the parentheses. So you would do 3 plus 2 to get 5, and then 4 times 5 to get 20. Now what I would like you to do instead of the parentheses first is something called distribution. Okay, distributive is like when you distribute something out, like a student gives out papers, candy, whatever, you're passing something out. In this case, we can think about passing the 4 or distributing the 4 to each of these parts inside the parentheses. Now it will still mean multiplication. So for example, I want to multiply this 4 times the 3 first. 4 times 3 is 12. And I have this bottom arrow to signify I need to also multiply the 2 because it's also in parentheses. So 4 times 2 is 8. And the last step here, I have a plus sign in the parentheses. Therefore, I need a plus sign in my solution. 12 plus 8 equals 20. The same thing we would have got if we added 3 plus 2 and then times that 5 by the 4. And you might be thinking, oh, that first way was easier, and you're probably right, but this second way is going to be important when we look at this second example down below using a variable in this algebraic expression. So we're going to follow the same methods. Oh, first let me say, up top you can certainly add 3 plus 2 inside the parentheses and get 5, but at the bottom, x plus 2, you cannot add x plus 2. You have to just leave it like that. X plus 2 is just x plus 2. The reason for that is that we don't know the value of x. You're not given the value of x. This is simply an expression. If it was an equation, we could try to find for x with the substitution, like things like the previous method. But for now, it's simply an expression. And you have x, and we don't know the quantity of x. We don't know the value of x. But that's okay. We can still use distributive property to reach this target. Okay? So we want to do kind of what we did at the top. Since we can't add x plus 2 because we do not know the value of x, we can multiply 4 times x. Okay? 4 times x is just 4x, right? It just looks like this. A 4 with an x next to it. We've talked about that before. And then this 4, just like above, has to multiply this 2. It has to multiply each part that's inside the parentheses. 4 times 2 is going to get you 8. And again, we have a plus sign in the parentheses, therefore we have to have a plus sign in our solution. Here we have our final answer. On these kind of questions, I'm not asking you to solve for x. You're simply distributing the term that's outside the parentheses across each term inside the parentheses using multiplication. So 4x plus 8 is your final answer. We don't know what x equals. We don't have to know because it's not that type of problem. Okay? If you look on the right-hand side, please take those notes if you haven't already, the steps. Number 1, multiply each term inside the parentheses. And then step two is to carry over the operator. Operator is kind of a strange sounding word, but it just means like, is it a plus sign, is it a minus sign, and so on. Let's do a couple more quick examples here. I think this can kind of be quick and easy once we get the hang of it. Okay, here we have 3 times x minus 3. So we got to, again, multiply the 3 that's on the outside by each term along the inside. So 3 times x, again, is just going to be 3x. Then you can multiply the 3 times 3. You get 9. We have a minus sign in the parentheses. Please put a minus sign in your final answer. And then you're done. It's just 3x minus 9. Now, somebody in class, actually, when we did an example like this, said, Mr. Doc, isn't the second part just like multiplying 3 times a negative 3? And he was right on. When you multiply a positive number by a negative number, you would get a negative number. So 3 times a negative 3 is really kind of like a negative 9, which is the same thing as minus 9. You'll learn more about that next year when you work a lot more with negative numbers. But minus 9 is the same thing as a negative 9. It's no difference there, okay? And let's just do this bottom example. 4 times 2 plus x. 4 times 2 is going to get us 8. 4 times x, just like previous, is going to get us 4x. Plus sign in the middle of the parentheses, therefore plus sign in your final answer. And you're done. The only little wrinkle or difference in this problem is that I put the variable in the second part of the parentheses, but it doesn't change the steps you have to do. 8 plus 4x is actually the same thing as 4x plus 8. Oopsie daisy. Because with addition, you could certainly turn the terms around or switch them the order, and it doesn't change the solution. It doesn't change your answer. So either way you wrote that one would be fine. Okay, that's all the notes for that. Just make sure you have in your notebook. There are no independent practice for this target.